Russia has a long history and can claim a long tradition of dividend in many aspects of the arts, especially when it comes to literature and philosophy, classical music and ballet, architecture and painting, cinema and animation, which all had considerable influence on world culture. The country also has a flavorful material culture and a tradition in technology. Russian culture grew from that of the East Slavs, with the pagan beliefs and specific way of life in the wooded areas of Eastern Europe. Early Russian culture was much influenced by neighbouring Finno-Ugric tribes and by nomadic, mainly Kipchak and Iranic peoples of the Pontic steppe. In the late first millennium AD, the Varangians also took part in the forming of Russian identity and Kievan Rus state. Kievan Rus had accepted Orthodox Christianity from the Eastern Roman Empire in 988, and thus largely defined the Russian culture of the next millennium as the synthesis of Slavic and Byzantine cultures. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Russia remained the largest Orthodox nation in the world and claimed succession to the Byzantine legacy in the form of the Third Rome idea. At different points in its history, the country was also strongly influenced by the culture of Western Europe. Since Peter the Great's reforms for 2 centuries, Russian culture largely developed in the general context of European culture rather than pursuing its own unique ways. The situation changed in the 20th century, when the communist ideology became a major factor in the culture of the Soviet Union, where Russia, or Russian SFSR, was the largest and leading part. Nowadays, Russian cultural heritage is ranked 7th in the Nation Brands Index, based on interviews of some 20,000 people mainly from Western countries and the Far East. Due to the relatively later involvement of Russia in modern globalization and international tourism, many aspects of Russian culture, like Russian jokes and Russian art, remain largely unknown to foreigners. Language. Russia's 160 ethnic groups speak some 100 languages. According to the 2002 census, 142.6 million people speak Russian, followed by Tatar with 5.3 million and Ukrainian with 1.8 million speakers. Russian is the only official state language, but the constitution gives the individual republics the right to make the native language co-official next to Russian. Despite its wide dispersal, the Russian language is homogeneous throughout Russia. Russian is the most geographically widespread language of Eurasia and the most widely spoken Slavic language. Russian belongs to the Indo-European language family and is one of the living members of the East Slavic languages, the others being Belarusian and Ukrainian. Written examples of Old East Slavic are attested from the 10th century onwards. Over a quarter of the world's scientific literature is published in Russian. Russian is also applied as a means of coding and storage of universal knowledge. 60 to 70% of all world information is published in the English and Russian languages. The language is one of the 6 official languages of the United Nations. Folklore. New Russian folklore takes its roots in the pagan beliefs of ancient Slavs, which is nowadays still represented in the Russian fairy tales. Epic Russian byliners are also an important part of Slavic mythology. The oldest byliners of Kievan cycle were actually recorded mostly in the Russian north, especially in Karelia, where most of the Finnish national epic Kalevala was recorded as well. Many Russian fairy tales and byliners were adapted for animation films, or for feature movies by famous directors like Alexander Tushko and Alexander Ru. Some Russian poets, including Pyotr Yushov and Leonid Filatov, created a number of well-known poetical interpretations of classical Russian fairy tales, and in some cases, like that of Alexander Pushkin, also created fully original fairy tale poems that became very popular. Folklorists today consider the 1920s the Soviet Union's golden age of folklore. The struggling new government, which had to focus its efforts on establishing a new administrative system and building up the nation's backwards economy, could not be bothered with attempting to control literature, so studies of folklore thrived. There were two primary trends of folklore study during the decade: the formalist and Finnish schools. Formalism focused on the artistic form of ancient byline and fairy tales, specifically the use of distinctive structures and poetic devices. The Finnish school was concerned with connections amongst related legends of various Eastern European regions. Finnish scholars collected comparable tales from multiple locales and analyzed the similarities and differences, hoping to trace these epic stories' migration paths. Once Joseph Stalin came to power and put his first 5-year plan into motion in 1928, the Soviet government began to criticize and censor folklore studies. Stalin and the Soviet regime repressed folklore, believing that it supported the old Tsarist system and a capitalist economy. They saw it as a reminder of the backward Russian society that the Bolsheviks were working to surpass. To keep folklore studies in check and prevent inappropriate ideas from spreading amongst the masses, the government created the RAP, the Russian Association of Proletarian Writers. The RAP specifically focused on censoring fairy tales and children's literature, believing that fantasies and bourgeois nonsense harmed the development of upstanding Soviet citizens. Fairy tales were removed from bookshelves and children were encouraged to read books focusing on nature and science. RAP eventually increased its levels of censorship and became the Union of Soviet Writers in 1932. In order to continue researching and analyzing folklore, intellectuals needed to justify its worth to the communist regime. Otherwise, collections of folklore, along with all other literature deemed useless for the purposes of Stalin's 5-year plan, would be an unacceptable realm of study. In 1934, Maxim Gorky gave a speech to the Union of Soviet Writers arguing that folklore could, in fact, be consciously used to promote communist values. Apart from expounding on the artistic value of folklore, he stressed that traditional legends and fairy tales showed ideal, community-oriented characters, which exemplified the model Soviet citizen. Folklore, with many of its conflicts based on the struggles of a labor-oriented lifestyle, was relevant to communism as it could not have existed without the direct contribution of the working classes. Also, Gorky explained that folklore characters expressed high levels of optimism, and therefore could encourage readers to maintain a positive mindset, especially as the lives change with the further development of communism. Yuri Sokolov, the head of the folklore section of the Union of Soviet Writers, also promoted the study of folklore by arguing that folklore had originally been the oral tradition of the working people, and consequently could be used to motivate and inspire collective projects amongst the present-day proletariat. Characters throughout traditional Russian folktales often found themselves on a journey of self-discovery, a process that led them to value themselves not as individuals but rather as a necessary part of a common whole. The attitudes of such legendary characters paralleled the mindset that the Soviet government wished to instill in its citizens. He also pointed out the existence of many tales that showed members of the working class outsmarting the cruel masters, again working to prove folklore's value to Soviet ideology and and the nation's society at large. Convinced by Gorky and Sokolov's arguments, the Soviet government and the Union of Soviet Writers began collecting and evaluating folklore from across the country. The Union hand-picked and recorded particular stories that, in their eyes, sufficiently promoted the collectivist spirit and showed the Soviet regime's benefits and progress. It then proceeded to redistribute copies of approved stories throughout the population. Meanwhile, local folklore centers arose in all major cities, responsible for advocating a sense of Soviet nationalism. These organizations ensured that the media published appropriate versions of Russian folk tales in a systematic fashion. Apart from circulating government-approved fairy tales and byliny that already existed, during Stalin's rule, authors parroting appropriate Soviet ideologies wrote communist folk tales and introduced them to the population. These contemporary folk tales combined the structures and motifs of the old byliny with contemporary life in the Soviet Union. Called noviny, these new tales were considered the renaissance of the Russian epic. Folklorists were called upon to teach modern folk songs the conventional style and structure of the traditional byliny. They also explained to the performers the appropriate types of communist ideology that should be represented in the new stories and songs. As the performers of the day were often poorly educated, they needed to obtain a thorough understanding of Marxist ideology before they could be expected to impart folk tales to the public in a manner that suited the Soviet government. Besides undergoing extensive education, many folk performers traveled throughout the nation in order to gain insight into the lives of the working class, and thus communicate the stories more effectively. Due to the crucial role in spreading communist ideals throughout the Soviet Union, eventually some of these performers became highly valued members of Soviet society. A number of them, despite their illiteracy, were even elected as members of the Union of Soviet Writers. These new Soviet fairy tales and folk songs primarily focused on the contrasts between a miserable life in old Tsarist Russia and an improved one under Stalin's leadership. The characters represented identities for which Soviet citizens should strive, exemplifying the traits of the new Soviet man. The heroes of Soviet tales were meant to portray a transformed and improved version of the average citizen, giving the reader a clear goal for an ideal community-oriented self that the future he or she was meant to become. These new folktales replaced magic with technology, and supernatural forces with Stalin. Instead of receiving essential advice from a mythical being, the protagonist would be given advice from omniscient Stalin. If the character followed Stalin's divine advice, he could be assured success in all his endeavors and a complete transformation into the new Soviet man. The villains of these contemporary fairy tales were the whites and the leader idolized Chet, the most monstrous idol, who was the equivalent of the Tsar. Descriptions of the whites in noviny mirrored those of the Tatars in byliny. In these new stories, the whites were incompetent, stagnant capitalists, while the Soviet citizens became invincible heroes. Once Stalin died in March 1953, folklorists of the period quickly abandoned the new folk tales, written by individual authors and performers. Noviny did not come from the oral traditions of the working class. Consequently, today they are considered pseudo-folklore, rather than genuine Soviet folklore. Without any true connection to the masses, there was no reason noviny should be considered anything other than contemporary literature. Specialists decided that attempts to represent contemporary life through the structure and artistry of the ancient epics could not be considered genuine folklore. Stalin's name has been omitted from the few surviving pseudo-folk tales of the period. Instead of considering folklore under Stalin a renaissance of the traditional Russian epic, today it is generally regarded as a period of restraint and falsehood. Russian literature is considered to be among the most influential and developed in the world, with some of the most famous literary works belonging to it. Russia's literary history dates back to the 10th century. In the 18th century its development was boosted by the works of Mikhail Lomonosov and Denis von Wissen, and by the early 19th century a modern native tradition had emerged, producing some of the greatest writers of all time. This period and the golden age of Russian poetry began with Alexander Pushkin, considered to be the founder of modern Russian literature and often described as the Russian Shakespeare or the Russian Goethe. It continued in the 19th century with the poetry of Mikhail Lermontov and Nikolai Nekrasov, dramas of Alexander Ostrovsky and Anton Chekhov, and the prose of Nikolai Gogol, Ivan Turgenev, Leo Tolstoy, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Mikhail Saltykov, Shkedrin, Ivan Goncharov, Alexei Pisamsky and Nikolai Leskov. Tolstoy and Dostoevsky in particular were titanic figures, to the point that many literary critics have described one or the other as the greatest novelist ever. By the 1880s Russian literature had begun to change. The age of the great novelists was over and short fiction and poetry became the dominant genres of Russian literature for the next several decades, which later became known as the Silver Age of Russian poetry, previously dominated by realism. Russian literature came under strong influence of symbolism in the years between 1893 and 1914. Leading writers of this age include Valery Bryansov, Andrei B. Vyacheslav Ivanov, Alexander Blok, Nikolai Gumilev, Dmitry Merezhkovsky, Fyodor Sologub, Anna Akhmatova, Osip Mandelstam, Marina Svetareva, Leonid Andreyev, Ivan Bunin, and Maxim Gorky. Following the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the ensuing civil war, Russian cultural life was left in chaos. Some prominent writers, like Ivan Bunin and Vladimir Nabokov, left the country, while a new generation of talented writers joined together in different organizations with the aim of creating a new and distinctive working-class culture appropriate for the new state, the Soviet Union. Throughout the 1920s writers enjoyed broad tolerance. In the 1930s censorship over literature was tightened in line with Joseph Stalin's policy of socialist realism. After his death the restrictions on literature were eased, and by the 1970s and 1980s writers were increasingly ignoring official guidelines. The leading authors of the Soviet era included Yevgeny Zamyatin, Isaac Babel, Vladimir Mayakovsky, I.L.F. and Petrov, Yuri Olisha, Mikhail Bulgakov, Boris Pasternak, Mikhail Sholokhov, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Yevgeny Yevtushenko, and Andrei Vazna-Insky. Soviet era was also the golden age of Russian science fiction, that was initially inspired by Western authors and enthusiastically developed with the success of Soviet space program. Authors like Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, Kir Bulichov, Ivan Yefremov, Alexander Belayev enjoyed mainstream popularity at the time. Philosophy. Some Russian writers, like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, are known also as philosophers, while many more authors are known primarily for the philosophical works. Russian philosophy blossomed since the 19th century, when it was defined initially by the opposition of Westernizers, advocating Russia's following the Western political and economical models, and Slavophiles, insisting on developing Russia as a unique civilization. The latter group includes Nikolai Danilevsky and Konstantin Leontiev, the early founders of Eurasianism. In its further development, Russian philosophy was always marked by a deep connection to literature and interest in creativity, society, politics and nationalism. Cosmos and religion were other primary subjects. Notable philosophers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries include Vladimir Solovyov, Sergei Bulgakov, Pavel Florensky, Nikolai Berdyaev, Vladimir Lossky and Vladimir Vernadsky. In the 20th century, Russian philosophy became dominated by Marxism. Humor. Russia owes much of its wit to the great flexibility and richness of the Russian language, allowing for puns and unexpected associations. As with any other nation, its vast scope ranges from lewd jokes and silly wordplay to political satire. Russian jokes, the most popular form of Russian humor, are short fictional stories or dialogues with a punchline. Russian joke culture features a series of categories with fixed and highly familiar settings and characters. Surprising effects are achieved by an endless variety of plots. Russians love jokes on topics found everywhere in the world, be it politics, spouse relations, or mothers-in-law. Chastushka, a type of traditional Russian poetry, is a single quatrain in trochaic tetrameter with an abab or ABCB rhyme scheme, usually humorous, satirical, or ironic in nature. Chastushkas are often put to music as well, usually with balalaika or accordion accompaniment. The rigid, short structure parallels limericks. The name originates from the Russian word meaning to speak fast.